Hey everyone, welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo, and we are continuing our summer movie catch-up for the month of August, where every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'm giving you a review from a movie that I haven't covered yet that came out this summer. And this is a movie that did come out this summer on Netflix. It did get a little bit of a shorter theatrical run a few months prior to it dropping on Netflix, and it actually got a festival run way back in 2023. So this has been a film that has been around for quite a while, and that is Hitman by Richard Linklater. But I think now most of the world has finally been able to see it, which is exciting. So now I can actually dive into my thoughts on this film. Richard Linklater is one of my all-time favorite directors. I know a lot of the times people will ask, what is your Letterboxd for films, or what is your Mount Rushmore for directors? And I think for that Mount Rushmore, it always interchanges. There's always that fourth spot is always in rotation. But I would always say that Richard Linklater has a place on my Mount Rushmore of directors. He's one of my four favorite filmmakers, not just because of the stylistic, kind of comfortability of living in his films, the way he kind of brings this atmosphere and this kind of hangout vibe to a lot of his films where you just feel like you want to just sit and live in the worlds that he creates, but the scripts he writes as well, the way he's able to kind of share so much wisdom and knowledge and such thought-provoking themes while still making it digestible too, where you don't feel like you're necessarily overwhelmed by the intellect. I really love the way he's able to marry his writing style with his visual style and just create great vibes. He's a vibe filmmaker, someone who you just want to live in those worlds. You want to just soak in all the atmosphere, all the language. You want to just talk with these characters and sit and hang out with these characters and hear what they have to say. And the best thing about Richard Linklater is that he continues to stretch himself as a filmmaker. And I think Hitman is a great example of a film that shows that Richard Linklater can kind of go a little bit outside the box with his storytelling, kind of create this more whimsical, inciting incident, these bigger swings with comedy and, very intense thrills, but still having that laid back kind of hangout-like vibe where you just still want to just sit with these characters and live with these characters and listen to them talk and interact. And you want to kind of just roam these streets and examine all these different people in their way of life. It's just really, really fascinating. And I think Hitman is one of my favorites of his. The film does follow Gary, played by Glenn Powell, who is a professor, but kind of works part-time for the FBI. And this is one of the greatest inciting incidents of any movie in recent memory. He basically works as a fake hitman for the FBI. He brings these people who are trying to plan a hit on someone they want to take out. He sits them down and he basically gets them to confess on tape so then the FBI can arrest that person. It's obviously a more fantastical premise because hitmans don't really exist in our world. I think that's something that is very much more like a movie and TV thing. As far as I know, maybe there's stuff I don't know. But I do think, that is a fantastical idea, but it's, again, presented with groundedness and reality because of how Richard Linklater structures his films. But it's such a great inciting incident that I honestly think if this was just 2 hours of this guy kind of pulling these cons on these people and kind of shape-shifting, because Glenn Powell, his character, he kind of molds each hitman to the person he is talking to. So you start to see a lot of the range in Gary's character as well, and you start to see him get this weird kind of confidence through each of the characters he creates. It's what Gary is doing as a character is kind of like the ultimate actor's exercise of improv, but it's also Glenn Powell doing Gary, doing all these acting roles. So it's kind of Glenn Powell also flexing that same improv skill and showing his range as an actor. But as I said, I think I could have just sat through 2 hours of that, of just him kind of meeting each person and seeing how he's able to get each one to confess. And I think that would have been alone a really, really great movie. But what happens about a half an hour into the movie, it kind of takes this pivot when he comes across Madison Figueroa Masters, who is played by Adria Arjona. More on her later because I think she gives a phenomenal performance. But she comes in wanting to kill her husband, and Gary's actually able to coerce her into not doing it because he does have a heart and he does care and he does have this kind of empathy for people that is very rare. You kind of have to go into this job with a coldness, without bias, but he ends up cracking and he ends up trying to find a way to get to this woman's heart and prevent her from doing what she does. And through that, they form a bond. And so it becomes this really fun, inciting incident about this hitman trying to pull off all these cons to then, oh, what happens now when you do actually get through to someone and you make a connection and you start to change that person's outlook. But then in doing so, he still has to keep up the act that he is a hitman because he doesn't want to let her know that he's been lying to him. And then they form a romance and you see how that kind of evolves. And then you start to see a lot of the more underlying, motives behind a lot of these characters kind of rise to the surface. It's a really really great way to just kind of evolve a really interesting premise into something totally unexpected, totally original. This feels like a movie I've never seen before, even though the familiarity of the atmosphere is something I assume from Richard Linklater film. Like, it's a very cozy atmosphere, and the way the characters talk and the dialogue, that's all expected from a Richard Linklater film. But the way the plot kind of just goes in all these different directions while still feeling like it has an overall message to say about identity, and the way we kind of put on a mask essentially to hide our true selves from others, and then how we struggle with how much we relay to others about our true selves. Again, there's so much stuff here that is so intriguing and so fascinating. But again, because it's Richard Linklater, it's presented in such a digestible and entertaining way. This is a crowd pleaser. And I know there's been a lot of pushback of like, Netflix should have put this in theaters. Why did they drop it right to Netflix? And I actually really, really agree with that, because I saw this in a theater in New York City at the Paris Theater, which I'm very fortunate I live close enough to go see it. The Paris Theater is where all of Netflix's movies kind of have their Oscar qualifying runs. They play there for a little bit so they can qualify for Oscars. You know, All Quiet on the Western Front, before it got nominated for Best Picture and everything, had like a big run there at the Paris. It's a great way to kind of see these Netflix films on the big screen, and I love the way the theater's kept. You know, there are ushers and everything's very clean, and you know, the seats, I found them very comfortable and very cozy. But you know, there was some magic of just like sitting in a theater and hearing people laugh to this and respond to this, because this does have its shocking moments. This also has great moments of comedy, and there's also great moments of intimacy and romance that can kind of get a little bit of sizzles from the audience as well. So I think this is a film that I really recommend. You know, that's probably not accessible in a theater to you now, but if you are lucky enough to someday be able to see this in a theater, please go see it. But if you watch this at home, I really do recommend getting a group together to watch it, because it is one of those movies that you want to be able to feel the energy of laughter and the energy of shocks and gasps and like, ooh, when things are getting steamy. Like, you really want that kind of atmosphere of reactions and verbal reactions. Because yeah, a film's enjoyable when you can just kind of watch it yourself and enjoy it with your own eyes. But feeling that energy around you, I mean, that's why we go to the movies. That's why we want that theatrical experience. We don't just go for the prime sound and visual quality from a theater, but we go because of that shared experience, that shared laughter, that shared energy, the fact that you are watching this with a bunch of people and all witnessing something that you've never seen before. And I think Hitman is one of those films that can really elicit such a great reaction from a crowd. So I really hope people, even at their homes, get people together to watch this film, because this has so many different twists and turns. And I think a lot of the entertainment value does come from its cast. And I said I'd talk about her in a bit, because Adria Arjona is one of my favorite performances of the last few years, not just this year. She has such a magnetic gaze on the screen that you just want to watch her, you want to lean in, because there's also a level of intrigue and mystery to her. Is she well intentioned? Does she have more sinister underlying motives at hand? And I think the beauty of this film is watching that and trying to figure out what her clear objective is, and you know, how much of this is a ruse, because we know Gary's motives throughout the entire thing. We know exactly what's a ruse and what's not. We see him quite literally going through these different disguises, but we don't necessarily know all of her story, because we're not seeing it from her perspective, which makes it all the more intriguing as a character. But I think her performance is also so just magnetic and captivating that I just couldn't keep my eyes off her. I thought she was just an incredible force in this film, going toe to toe with Glenn Powell, who I also think is doing the best work of his career. He has had quite a few years, from Top Gun Maverick to Anyone But You, now this, going into Twisters, which we'll talk about on Monday, because I wanted to do a little Glenn Powell double feature here. But you know, Glenn Powell is also having quite a moment, and this, I think, is the most acting he's done, the most versatility he's brought to any of his roles, because he's playing essentially so many different roles, but he still also has to have Gary underneath all of that. You know, they are merely masks and facades for the true Gary. And I think it's very fascinating to see him kind of take on all these different little personas while still having a little bit of Gary in each of them. It's a really great piece, and it does kind of harken back to that theme of identity and, you know, what we perceive ourselves as versus what we want others to perceive us as, versus, you know, just kind of navigating the everyday life, not necessarily knowing who you are yet, and necessarily knowing who you want to be and what you're capable of as a person, both good and bad. And I just think this film does such a good job at that. Austin Amelio is also a great actor in this thing. Jasper, he was on The Walking Dead, but he plays Jasper, this undercover cop who kind of acts as kind of the foil, kind of the villain, if you will, of the piece. But even saying anyone in this film is a villain is a bit of a loose term, because it really is a matter of perspective, because there are certain characters that do some things that are just totally not good, and then some characters that you understand their motives, but you still don't necessarily agree with what they're doing. And I think that's another great thing that this film has, that Richard Linklater brings to the material, is this kind of moralistic ambiguity of like not necessarily knowing if we should be rooting for these people. We're rooting for these people because we like these people, but we're not rooting for these people because we know what they're doing is wrong. So it's kind of this weird kind of balancing act that this film has, but we're still utterly charmed by it. And I think that's the power of Richard Linklater's characters and how he writes, is that we are still able to feel what they're feeling. We're still able to empathize with them, even if we don't necessarily agree with them. And then by the end, even though it does take a twisted kind of ending, it's like at a Thanksgiving dinner when you're so full you could barely stand and you've kind of unbuttoned your pants and taken off your belt and you're like, I can barely move because I ate so much, but I ate a really good meal. And that's kind of what the end of this film is. It's like, oh my God, I've been just feasting for 2 hours and I love this. Even though I feel a little bit bad about it, I'm probably going to regret it later and I'm probably going to feel icky for it. I still feel very content. And I think that's kind of the ending of this film. Like, it is a very polarizing ending and people have loved it, people have hated it. But I think even if you hate it, I think there's still a satisfaction in the story you've been seeing up to that point and the way this kind of leaves a little bit of a zinger for the audience to kind of think about as they leave the theater or the screen, if you will, if you're at your own home. But I really just think, this just has so much great stuff in it. I think the makeup is really well done. I wish this was more of an Oscar contender. It's going to probably fall below the wayside just because Netflix has other things that they're pushing this year. But I do think Glenn Powell especially could get a lead actor nomination if they were to push him, because he is so versatile. He kind of blends into all these roles so effortlessly. And as Gary, he brings so much interesting, character and personality to that. I think Adria Arjona should be our Best Supporting Actress winner this year, but she's probably not going to get nominated again because I don't think Netflix is pushing this thing. But she is just so good. And she's also in Blink Twice, which I also saw yesterday. And she's very good in that. She's probably my favorite performance in that film as well. So she's just having a great summer as well. But I also think the makeup is a really admirable aspect of this film too, because you have to disguise this guy as he goes through these different missions. And I think some of the disguises are just so fun to watch. And you kind of see him kind of applying the prosthetics sometimes and like getting into character, which is really fun, especially in the earlier parts of the film. There's one disguise in particular that's like Tilda Swinton, which I think is very funny. So I really think if there were categories to be considered for this, I mean, obviously picture and writing and directing, but I think if Netflix really wanted to push it, which they should really push the makeup and hairstyling, and then they should push Glenn Powell and Adria Arjona. I really hope it gets some sort of recognition, because I think it's a great film and it's just an easy breezy watch. And I think that's just kind of the MO of Richard Linklater. There's a lot to chew on, a lot to think about, but at the end of the day, it's still so digestible, which makes it easily rewatchable. I've rewatched this more than any other film this summer so far because it is very enjoyable, but also very easy to swallow, even though it is very complex and very nuanced at the same time. So that's my review for Hitman. If you've seen it, let me know in the comments below what you think of it and if you love it as much as I do. And if you got to see it in the theater, let me know about your experience there. Did it benefit seeing it in a theater versus seeing it at home? And if you've seen it at home, let me know if you're planning on doing a movie night with your friends, because I do think this is one that you should experience with a crowd if you can. So thank you so much for watching. Next Monday, as I teased, we will be doing Twisters as kind of our Glenn Powell double feature here, because he is having quite a summer. So we are going to be talking about Twisters on Monday. I'm hoping to see it in 4DX this week, and I'm really hoping, if I can, to get that full Twisters experience. But either way, we're getting twisted on Monday. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.